The dog did not bark. That was the thing she noticed first, 3 weeks in. The way the dog had stopped watching her from the corner of its eye and started watching the same things she watched. The hills, the weather, the flock threading below through the February gray. Now it sat beside her on the ridge, its shoulder level with her knee, and neither of them moved. The stone was flat and pale against the frozen ground, no larger than a saddle blanket. Someone had set it level into the earth with care, tamping the corners so it would not shift. There was no name on it. There was nothing on it at all, only the weight of it, and the way the ground around it was undisturbed, as though even the frost had decided to leave that particular square of earth alone. She stood with her sewing basket held against her side, the broken latch pressing cold through her coat. She had not meant to come this far up the ridge. She had followed the fence line the way he had shown her, checking the wire for sag, and the line had brought her here. Below, the flock moved in its slow collective drift across the lower slope. 340 head, give or take the 4 they had lost to a canyon storm in November, before she arrived. She had learned to count them at a distance, not one by one but in clusters, the way he did, reading the mass of them for anything wrong. Nothing was wrong this morning. The sky was the color of pewter hammered thin, and the cold came in from the north, steady and without malice, the kind of cold that was simply the condition of the world up here, not a threat, but a fact. Her breath moved in small clouds and disappeared. She did not know exactly whose grave this was. She had not been told. She had not asked. But she had been here 4 months now, and she had learned to read this land the way you learn to read a face, not from what it offered, but from what it withheld. The way he moved past this ridge without looking up when the flock was close to it. The way he had, only once, in November, climbed up here alone in the last of the light and stood without moving for a long time, and come back down and said nothing, and eaten his supper and gone to bed. She understood without understanding. The dog shifted its weight against her leg. Far below, the flock turned at the tree line and began to move back toward the lower pasture, following some logic of grass or wind that she was still learning to read. She watched them settle into their new direction. She had a hem to finish before the light went. She had accounts to enter. She had a whole day of ordinary work waiting at the bottom of the hill. She stayed another minute anyway. She had stood on that platform 4 months ago with the October wind coming off the mountains and the smell of iron and coal still on her coat from the 3-day ride west. The trunk had been heavy. She had not asked for help carrying it from the rail car. She had managed the steps herself, one hand on the rail, the basket hooked over her wrist, its latch clicking loose and catching again with every movement. She had set the trunk down on the platform boards and straightened and looked at what Verity was. One main street, a livery at the far end, a general store with a covered porch where 4 or 5 people had arranged themselves with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting for something to arrive. She had kept her chin level. He was standing apart from them, at the near end of the platform, hat in his hands. He was taller than she had expected from the letter, which had been brief and said almost nothing about him, except what the work required. He was turning the hat brim slowly with both hands, not from nerves, she would think later, but from a need to be doing something with them. He had not prepared a speech, she could see that. She did not mind. She had not prepared one either. From the general store porch, a woman's voice carried across the distance between them, with the ease of long practice. "Awful long way to come for a sheep camp." The words landed in the open air and stayed there. He did not turn toward the voice. He did not answer it. He looked at her, directly, without apology, and then he walked across the platform and picked up the trunk. He did not ask if she needed help. He did not comment on the weight. He simply took it up and stood waiting, and she understood that waiting was an offer. She picked up the sewing basket and followed him. They walked the length of the platform together without speaking. She was aware of the porch watching. She kept her eyes on the street ahead. The wagon was hitched at the rail beyond the platform steps. He loaded the trunk into the bed, with the same economy he would bring to every physical task she would observe in the months ahead. No wasted motion, no performance of effort. He came around to the front and stood by the wheel. She climbed up herself. He did not comment on that either. He came around and took his seat and gathered the lines, and they pulled away from Verity without ceremony, the horses steady, the mountains ahead of them massive and blue-white in the afternoon light. She held the basket in her lap with both hands. The latch clicked open on a rut in the road, and she pressed it shut with her thumb. He looked straight ahead. The town fell behind them. The road out of Verity was not much of a road. It had been worn into the ground by wagons and weather, and the slow passage of seasons that did not concern themselves with the comfort of travelers. She held the basket in her lap for the first mile, then set it on the bench between them, when the ruts grew deep enough that keeping hold of it cost her balance. It rattled there, the broken latch ticking open and catching shut with every pitch and roll of the wheels. He did not seem to notice. He held the lines loosely, the horses knowing the way without much guidance, and he kept his eyes on the ground ahead, the way a man does when he is watching for ice or soft earth, reading the road as a habit rather than a necessity. She watched the hills. They were not the hills she had imagined from a church circular in St. Louis. They were larger, not in the way a building is large, with edges you can measure, but in the way weather is large, filling the whole frame of vision without apology, the grass pale and flattened under the October wind, the ridgelines carrying the first hard blue of snow, where the elevation tipped above what the season could yet thaw. She had not known country could press on you the way this did, not threateningly, simply completely. The wagon tilted up a grade, and the mountains ahead of them clarified against the sky, and she understood for the first time that she was not going toward something, but into it. 2 miles passed. The horses worked steadily. A hawk turned overhead without any effort she could see. He spoke once. He said the house was stone, so it held heat well. She said that was good. That was all. She meant it. She had been cold in St. Louis in ways that had nothing to do with temperature, and she was not above being grateful for a wall that kept the wind out. She filed the information alongside the other small things she had noted. The wagon was well maintained. The horses were not thin. The harness had been mended recently, and mended correctly. A man who kept his equipment told you something about himself without intending to. She looked back at the basket between them. The latch had come open again, and she reached over and pressed it shut, and left her hand there for a moment on the worn wicker, feeling the rattle of the road come up through it, and then she set her hand back in her lap. The grade steepened. The horses leaned into it without complaint. Ahead, the road curved around a shelf of rock, and she could not yet see what waited beyond it. Only the sky, and the white edge of the ridge, and the tall grass bending in a wind that she could not yet feel, but that was already moving through the hills, as though it had been there for 1,000 years, and planned to stay. The house was 2 rooms and a low ceiling, and it smelled of tallow and something older, a residue of years she could not name. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he set her trunk down, reading the space the way she had learned to read a room, where the light came from, where the cold came in, what had been touched recently, and what had not. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a stove, and a shelf of account books, arranged with no particular logic. A tin candle holder sat on the sill above the east window. The second room was hers. He said so with a gesture and nothing further, and she understood that the arrangement had been considered, that there was a line drawn somewhere in the timber framing of the house, and that he had put thought into where it fell. She unpacked what needed unpacking. She did not ask where things went. She found where they were and worked from there. By the second day, she had located the split in the lambing shed door, a diagonal crack from hinge to frame that let the cold through in a thin blade, the kind that killed newborns in March. She found timber scraps stacked in the barn, dry and cut to purpose, as though someone had intended to use them, and she selected a piece and fitted it to the gap and secured it with nails from a rusted tin on the workbench. She had not been asked to do it. The lambing shed was not her room. She did it because it needed doing, and she had seen the nails and the wood and had hands. The account books troubled her more. The shelf was set against the north wall, where the light died by mid-morning, and whoever had been keeping them, him, she assumed, alone and after dark, had been working by candlelight through figures that did not need to be difficult. She moved them to the table by the east window without asking. She understood this was a liberty. She took it anyway. That evening she found the ledger among them. It was older than the others. The spine softened with handling, and she opened it from habit. The habit of a woman who had kept accounts for 4 years and knew the language of columns. She found the last page with entries on it, found the final blank column, and stood looking at it for a moment, without knowing precisely what she was looking at, only that it had been left, and that the leaving of it was not accidental. She set it open on the table and began supper. He came in at dusk with the cold still on his coat, stopped in the doorway, and read the room the same way she had read it 3 days before. His eyes moved across the relocated books, the fitted door visible from where he stood, the pot on the stove, then the ledger. He crossed the room and closed it. He did not look at her. He sat down at the table, and she set the bowl in front of him, and they ate without speaking, the candle burning in the east window above, where the books had been. The next morning, she made biscuits. She had found flour in the back of the pantry shelf, a tin of lard, a jar of dried rose hips she did not use. The dough came together quickly, the way it always had when she was not thinking about anything in particular, and she put them in the Dutch oven and set it over the coals without ceremony. He was already out. She had heard the door before light. The biscuits were cooling on a cloth when the knock came. Not a knock exactly, more a hand against the door frame, tentative, the sound of someone checking whether a thing was allowed. She opened the door and found a girl standing on the step, 7 years old perhaps, brown-haired, wearing a coat slightly too large for her, watching her with the frank and undefended curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to disguise it. She said she lived next over. She said her name and then asked if she could come in. She was given a biscuit and a place at the table without any fuss made of it. What followed was half an hour of nearly unbroken talking. The girl ate 3 biscuits and in between asked about the sewing basket, about where St. Louis was, about whether she had seen the creek in summer, about what the baskets were woven from. She answered each question plainly. The girl did not require much in return. She moved between questions like a starling between fence posts, light and directionless, pleased simply to be heard. She asked once, near the end, whether she was going to stay. She said she expected so. The girl considered this. Then she said that the man who lived here was sad. She did not answer that. The girl left when she heard her mother's voice carrying from the next ridge, climbed down from the chair, fastened her coat with some difficulty at the top button, and let herself out the way she had come. The door swung in the cold air before it caught. She stood at the table a moment with the cloth in her hands. He came in not long after, shed his coat, moved to the basin. He had seen the girl leave from somewhere, the hill or the fence. His eyes went to the table, the 3 biscuit shapes missing from the cloth, the empty cup she had given her. He said, quietly, without turning around, "She hasn't done that since." He didn't say, "Since when?" She didn't ask. He dried his hands and set the cloth over the basin's edge and went back out without eating, pulling the door behind him until it latched. She heard his footsteps on the stone, then nothing. She stood in the kitchen in the particular silence he left behind him, and after a moment she folded the cloth and set it on the shelf and began to clear the table. The cold came down on a Thursday, which she knew only because she had been marking the days in the margin of the ledger. A small habit, a line for each morning, the way she had kept accounts since she was 19 and needed to know where she stood. By midday, the temperature had dropped past what the morning had suggested was possible. She brought in extra wood without being told. She filled the kettle and left it on the back of the stove where it would hold heat without boiling off. Small preparations, the kind a person makes when they have learned to read a place. He came in at dusk and said 2 words. "Lambing shed." She followed him out. The shed was stone on 2 sides and timber on the other 2, and the cold came through the timber. He had lanterns hung on the crossbeams, 3 of them, and in their light she could see the ewes, both lying wrong, their breathing shallow and labored in a way that did not need explaining. He did not explain. He directed her in short, flat sentences, and she did what he said. She had never done this before. She did not say so. She was not sure it mattered. The first hour was difficult in the particular way that physical work in cold is difficult. Not painful yet, only demanding, requiring the full attention of the body. She focused on what he told her. Where to put her hands, how much pressure, when to wait. The second hour was worse. Somewhere past midnight, the cold stopped being something she noticed separately. It was simply part of what the night was. The first lamb came at 1:30. She heard him exhale. Not relief, something quieter than that. Just the sound of a man releasing something he had been holding. The lamb was alive, small and wrong-looking and alive. The second did not come in time. He worked another hour, and she held the lantern where he needed it, and did not look at his face. She looked at his hands. When he finally sat back on his heels and set his palms flat on his thighs, she understood. He stayed that way for a moment. She did not move. Then he stood and began to clean up with the efficiency of someone who has done this before and knows it doesn't end the work. Dawn came gray and thin over the eastern ridge. She went to the trough outside the shed and broke the skin of ice with her elbow and put her hands in the water. It was cold enough that her hands stopped registering it within seconds. She scrubbed them anyway. She heard him behind her. She did not turn. Something settled over her shoulders, heavy, wool-lined, smelling of lanolin and cold air. His coat. She put her arms through the sleeves. He had already turned back toward the shed. She stood at the trough a moment longer, her hands dripping, watching the light come up over the ridge. 3 days after the lambing shed, she walked down to Verity for flour and thread. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that made the town look smaller than it was, every building drawn inward on itself. She carried the basket over her arm, the one with the broken latch, held shut with 2 fingers, and she went to the general store and set her list on the counter and waited. The woman behind the counter was in conversation with 2 others when she came in. A third stood near the bolts of cloth at the wall. The conversation did not stop. It adjusted. She heard the shape of it before she understood the words. Something about the arrangement, something about what kind of woman. The precise thing came near the end, delivered in the tone women use when they are being careful, when they want the sharpness to land without their fingerprints on it. Practical necessity, I suppose. Some men will take what they can find when they've waited long enough. A small sound of agreement from somewhere behind her. She set her hands on the counter. She looked at the woman directly. She said the amount for the flour and thread, without raising her voice or lowering it. The woman behind the counter filled the order. She paid. She put the flour and the thread in the basket and held the latch shut with 2 fingers and walked out. The walk back was an hour on the road that rose toward the hills, then another 20 minutes on the track to the house. She did not move faster than usual. The cold had settled into her ears and the tops of her hands, and she noticed it, the way she had learned to notice discomfort out here, as information, not complaint. She put away the flower. She did not start supper early. She sat at the table and took out the mending, a pair of work trousers with a split seam at the knee, and she sewed with even, unhurried stitches. He came in from the lambing shed as the light was going. He washed his hands at the basin. He looked at the stove, saw nothing had started, looked at her. She did not look up. She turned the trouser leg and continued. He hung his coat. He sat down across from her. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, without watching. He was looking at her shoulders, she thought, not at her face, at the set of her shoulders. After a moment he said, "Verity talks." He paused. "It doesn't decide." She kept her eyes on the needle, pushed it through the fabric, drew the thread taut. She did not answer him, but something in the room changed slightly, the way a room changes when a window that has been open all winter is finally closed. Not warmer exactly, just less exposed. Her shoulders settled. She kept sewing. The snow had come properly now, not the dusting of November that melted by mid-morning, but the real thing, dense and settled and indifferent to whatever lay beneath it. The flock moved slowly in it. He moved with them, bending his path to theirs, the way a man learns to over years. She had watched from the window as he took them down toward the lower pasture. The basin below the ridge held less wind. He had explained this to her once, briefly, without looking at her. The cold comes from the north. The ridge breaks it, and she had filed it away with everything else she had learned about this place by watching. When the last of the sheep disappeared below the tree line, she pulled on her coat. She did not plan to go to the ridge. She went to check the line she had strung between the corner post and the shed to see if the tea towels had frozen stiff. They had. She unpegged them and folded them under her arm, and then she stood looking up at the ridge, which was close and white and quiet. She climbed it. The stone was not hard to find. It sat where the ground flattened briefly before the long drop to the north pasture, a flat-topped piece of granite, pale against the snow, not dressed or carved, just placed, set with enough intention that it could not be mistaken for anything else. She stood before it for a long moment. The wind moved her collar against her cheek. She looked at the stone and thought about 3 years. 3 years of him moving this land alone, sleeping in that house alone, making entries in the ledger, and eating what he cooked himself, and watching this stone from wherever he worked, without going to it, unless he had reason. She did not touch it. She went back down. That night he fell asleep early, his chair pushed back from the table, his head tipped forward. She moved quietly. She cleared the supper things, and then she saw the ledger on the shelf where he kept it, in its usual place, the spine worn smooth from handling. She took it to the table and opened it. He had kept it faithfully, every page from 1880 forward. Wool yields, head count, feed costs, the dates of lambing, the dates of loss. His handwriting was plain and consistent until the entries from October of that year, when it changed. Not dramatically, just slightly smaller, the letters more compressed, the spacing tighter, as if he had been pressing down harder than he meant to. The change lasted through December of 1880, and then, slowly, leveled again. She read through all of it, all 3 years. The last column, the rightmost one, ruled in his hand, was empty, had always been empty. She could not tell what it had been meant to hold. She closed the ledger and set it back exactly where it had been. The storm came in the night, and by morning the window was white to the sill. She stood at the glass and looked out at nothing. The shapes of the yard had disappeared. The lambing shed was gone. There was only the gray-white press of it, and the sound, not howling as she had imagined blizzards would sound, but a steadier thing, a long continuous exhalation, like something very large breathing against the walls. He had gone out before first light. She had heard him. He came back an hour later with ice in his hair and both hands red to the wrist, and he said the flock was in the shed, and the shed was holding, and that was all he said. They stayed in. The first day was fine. There was mending. There was the ledger she had returned to its shelf. There were the ordinary hours of a house that had learned to hold two people without requiring them to explain themselves to each other. The second day was harder. The fire needed feeding more often. The wood was stacked inside the door, and the stack shrank. She measured it with her eyes. He did too. She could tell. Each time he added a piece. That night the wind picked up again. She had not thought it could worsen, but it did. The candle on the table threw light that moved. He was sitting across from her. He had not been reading. He had his hands flat on his knees, and he was looking at the middle of the table. He said, "She died in shearing week, October of 1880. She did not look up from her work immediately. She set one stitch, and then she looked up. The flock needed working. We were already in it. I thought she had more time than she did." He stopped. His jaw moved once, as if adjusting something. "I was with the flock. That was all." She held the needle. The fire shifted. "I kept accounts for a man who trusted me with everything," she said. "He lost it all the same, not through any mistake I made, not through any mistake he made, really." She set the mending down flat on her knee. "Some things aren't the keeper's fault." He looked at her then. She did not look away from it. The fire had burned to coals. Neither of them reached for wood. The room cooled by a degree, maybe two, and still they sat with it. The low red light, the sound of the storm working at the eaves, the weight of what had just been said, and what had not been said, holding the air between them like something neither wanted to disturb. The storm broke sometime in the night. By morning the sky had gone pale and still, the kind of still that comes after a long pressure releases, and the snow on the ground was unmarked and blue in the early light. She was up before him. He heard the door when he was still in his coat, still pulling on his second boot, and by the time he stepped outside, she was already past the near fence, moving uphill through the unbroken snow. She had the sewing basket over one arm. Her breath came in small white intervals. He watched her go, the dark shape of her moving steadily against all that white, the basket swinging once and then held still against her side. He did not call out. He stood in the yard until she crested the first rise, and then she was gone from sight over the ridge where the flat stone was. He turned and went to the lambing shed. The flock needed moving to the lower pasture before the temperature dropped again, and the shallow creek froze at the crossing. He worked steadily. The ewes moved without trouble. Two of the older ones had to be turned back from the far fence, and he did it without raising his voice, only his arm extended, patient, and they came. He did not look up toward the ridge again, but he knew when she came back down. He did not see her return. He was on the far side of the pasture, but something in the quality of the morning shifted, the way a room changes when someone enters it. And when he brought the last of the flock through the gate and latched it, she was in the yard hanging a cloth over the fence rail to dry. She did not say where she had been. He did not ask. They ate at midday in the usual quiet. She had left the basket on the windowsill before sitting down. He noticed the latch still hanging loose, the way it had since October, one pin pulled free of the leather. After she went to the mending room, he took the basket from the sill. He carried it to the barn. It took him a while to find what he needed. A small iron clasp in the tin of spare hardware he kept on the middle shelf. Older hardware, pieces he had saved from other repairs without knowing why. He sat on the workbench in the cold light of the barn window and fitted the clasp to the hinge. He worked slowly. He did not hurry. He set the basket back on the table before she came out. He was already at the ledger when she saw it. She came out of the mending room an hour later. He heard her steps cross the main room floor and then stop, a pause that was different from the ordinary pauses of the house. He did not look up from the ledger. After a moment, she moved to the table, and he heard the soft sound of the basket being lifted. Then nothing. Then set back down. He kept his eyes on the column in front of him. The numbers had not changed. He was not reading them. She went to the window. He heard her there, not restless, just standing. And then she moved back to the mending room, and he heard the scrape of her chair and the familiar settling-in sounds of her work beginning again. That was all. The evening came on the way it did in February, fast and absolute, the light draining from the high windows before the fire had properly warmed the room. He went out to the lambing shed at last light to check the 3 ewes closest to their time, 2 of them settled and still, the third restless in the far corner circling. He watched her a while and decided she would wait until morning. He came back through the door, knocking the mud from his boots, and stopped. There were 2 cups on the counter. His was in its usual place to the right of the stove. Hers, which he had only ever seen at her side of the table, was set beside it, both of them full, a narrow thread of steam rising from each. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to. She was at the table with the basket open, her back to him, needle moving through something dark-colored in the lamplight. She did not turn around. She had not arranged it to be noticed. She had simply put the cup there and gone back to her work. He crossed the room. He stood at the counter and drank from his cup, standing, the way a man might stop at a fence line for a moment before moving on, not settling, not making it into anything. He could hear the pull of thread through fabric behind him. The fire, the wind against the north wall, nothing unusual in any of it. He finished the coffee. He set the cup back down on the counter where she had placed it, beside the other one. He did not sit. He could not have said exactly why, only that sitting would have been a kind of statement he was not ready to make aloud, not yet, and that standing in the warm room with the sound of her work behind him was already more than he had expected to carry back in from the cold. The first morning of April came in clear, the kind of clear that only follows a hard winter, the air thin and exact, the light coming sideways across the high country in a way that made everything cast a shadow longer than itself. She had the coffee ready before the sky was fully light. She did not need to be asked anymore. She walked out with him when he went to check the upper fence. She had started doing this a few weeks before, without discussion, simply appearing at the door with her coat on when she heard him pull his boots. He had not said anything about it. She had not asked permission. They went through the low gate and up the long slope in single file, her breath visible in the cold, the flock moving below them on the south-facing hill in their slow, broad way. At the ridge he stopped. She stopped a half-step behind him. He removed his hat and held it at his side. The flat stone was clear of snow now, the ground around it just beginning to soften. He stood the way a man stands when he is not performing anything, head level, shoulders low, looking at the stone without urgency, without whatever it was that grief looked like when it was still raw. She stood beside him and said nothing. The wind moved across the ridge. Below, a ewe called and was answered. He was still for what might have been a full minute. Then he set his hat back on his head and reached, not with any announcement, not with any change in how he was standing, and took her hand. His fingers closed around hers and stayed there. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. They stood a moment longer at the stone, the 2 of them, looking out at the land he had worked alone for 3 years, and the flock that had waited through all of it. Then the flock moved, the way flocks do, drifting toward the lower pasture without reason, and he followed because that was the work, and the work went on. His hand released hers naturally, the way a man lets go of a fence rail when he is ready to walk again. She followed him down the slope. That evening, after supper, she opened the ranch ledger to the last column. the one that had sat empty since before she arrived. She filled it in with her careful, even hand. Her name, the date, and in the space where a heading might have gone, one word. Home. She closed the ledger and set it back on the shelf. The fire was low. Outside, the first spring dark settled over the hills.